There is a process happening, slowly and silently, inside the arteries of most people as they age, and it has a name worth knowing: atherosclerosis. It is the gradual buildup of plaque, a mixture of cholesterol, fat, calcium, and inflammatory cells, in the walls of the arteries, narrowing them and stiffening them over the years. It is silent precisely because it produces no symptoms until it is quite advanced, which is why so many heart attacks and strokes seem to arrive out of nowhere when they have in fact been decades in the making. The genuinely good news, the news this video is built around, is that diet has a real and well-documented influence on that process, and that even after 65, the arteries respond to change. They are not set in stone. So, we are going to look honestly at 5 categories of food that the evidence most strongly links to artery damage, exactly how each one does its harm, and what to do instead, without pretending any single food is either a poison or a cure. Let me be straight about the framing right at the start, because honesty is the whole point here. You will see this topic presented as a list of foods you must never touch again, as though one bite tips you over a cliff. That is not how arteries work, and it is not how the evidence reads. What matters is the pattern over years, the everyday and the frequent, far more than the occasional. So this is not a video about fear or about banning the foods you love at a holiday table. It is about the things that, eaten regularly and without much thought, quietly add up, and about cutting back on those in ways you can actually sustain. Moderation that you keep beats perfection that you abandon every single time. If steady, honest health information is the kind of thing you actually want, subscribing genuinely helps, because the careful version of this, the version that tells you the truth about moderation instead of frightening you into an impossible diet, tends to get buried under the louder version. Plain truth never travels as fast as alarm. So, if this is useful to you, hit subscribe and you will keep grounded information in front of you. Before the list, it helps to understand the actual machinery of how an artery gets clogged, because once you see the mechanism, each food on the list makes immediate sense rather than being something to memorize. The inner lining of every artery is a delicate, active layer of cells called the endothelium. When that lining is healthy, blood flows smoothly, and the vessel relaxes and contracts as it should. The trouble begins when the endothelium is injured or inflamed by high blood pressure pounding against it, by high blood sugar, by the chemical irritation of certain compounds, or by an excess of the wrong kind of cholesterol particles in the blood. Once the lining is damaged, LDL cholesterol particles slip into the wall of the artery beneath it. There they become oxidized, and the immune system, treating this as a threat, sends in cells to engulf them. Those cells become bloated and foamy, accumulate, and form the early streak of a plaque. Over years, the plaque grows, hardens, and narrows the channel the blood flows through. Sometimes a plaque ruptures, a clot forms on it suddenly, and that is the moment of a heart attack or a stroke. Every food on the list that follows earns its place by feeding some step in that exact chain, by inflaming the lining, by raising the harmful cholesterol, by spiking blood sugar, or by driving up the blood pressure that batters the wall. It is worth lingering on one hopeful fact because it changes how this whole topic should feel. Arteries are not a one-way street that only ever narrows. The plaque-forming process can be slowed, and in some respects partly stabilized when its drivers are removed. When LDL cholesterol in the blood comes down, the steady supply of particles feeding into the artery wall diminishes, and the body's repair processes get a chance to gain ground. When blood pressure eases, the mechanical battering of the lining lets up. When inflammation subsides, the immune activity churning inside a plaque quiets. Research on intensive cholesterol lowering, for example, has shown that plaques can become more stable and less likely to rupture, and rupture is the event that actually causes most heart attacks. This does not mean diet reverses decades of buildup overnight or melts plaque away like ice, and anyone claiming that is overselling. But it does mean the trajectory is not fixed. A person who changes course at 65 is not too late, because they are influencing what happens to their arteries from this day forward, and that forward-looking influence is real at any age. The arteries are living tissue responding continuously to the conditions you create for them, which is precisely why the everyday choices carry the weight they do. Let me ground this in a realistic example before we count down. Consider a 68-year-old retired postal worker whose annual physical showed rising cholesterol and creeping blood pressure, the early warning signs his doctor wanted to address before they became something worse. He was not eating outrageously by his own sense of it. But when he and a dietitian actually looked at a typical week, the pattern was clear. A fast food lunch several times a week, a couple of sodas a day out of habit, processed lunch meat in his sandwiches, and very little in the way of vegetables or whole foods. He did not overhaul everything overnight. He cut the soda first, then shifted his lunches, then his sandwich fillings, one change settling in before he made the next. Over the following months, his cholesterol and blood pressure both improved, and his doctor was able to hold off on adding a second medication. It was not one heroic change, it was several sustainable ones, stacked over time. That is the honest shape of how this actually works, and it is worth holding in mind as we go through the list, because no single item below is the whole story. If you know someone over 65 whose diet runs heavily toward these foods without much thought, sharing this could genuinely help them, especially the message that cutting back beats giving up and that arteries respond even later in life. Pass it along directly, because the algorithm rarely will on its own. So let's count it down. Here are 5 categories of food, ordered from the harmful to the most worth taking seriously, with exactly what each one does to your arteries, and an honest note on where the evidence is strong and where it is more nuanced. Number 5. Sugary drinks. Sodas, sweetened juices, sweet tea, energy drinks, and the like. These earn their place not because sugar directly coats your arteries, which is a myth, but through a more roundabout and well-documented route. Liquid sugar is absorbed rapidly and in large quantities, producing sharp spikes in blood sugar and, over time, contributing to insulin resistance, weight gain around the middle, and elevated triglycerides, a type of fat in the blood. High triglycerides and the metabolic disturbance that comes with chronic excess sugar are genuinely linked to atherosclerosis and to the inflammation that damages the artery lining. Sugary drinks are especially worth singling out because they deliver all of this with no fiber, no nutrition, and no real fullness, so the body barely registers them as food, even as they do their quiet work. Cutting them is one of the highest value, lowest sacrifice changes available because few people will truly miss the soda once water, sparkling water, or unsweetened tea takes its place. The sugar-to-artery connection deserves a little more detail because it runs through an organ people rarely think of in this context, the liver. When large amounts of sugar, particularly fructose, arrive rapidly and repeatedly, the liver converts much of the excess into fat. Some of that fat is shipped out into the blood as triglycerides, raising the levels that are independently linked to cardiovascular risk, and some of it accumulates in the liver itself, contributing to a condition of fatty liver that is now strikingly common and that worsens the body's whole metabolic picture. A metabolism under this kind of chronic sugar pressure tends toward higher triglycerides, lower protective HDL cholesterol, smaller and denser and more harmful LDL particles, and more inflammation, a cluster that reads almost like a recipe for atherosclerosis. So, the harm from sugary drinks is not that sugar sticks to artery walls, which it does not, but that a chronic flood of liquid sugar reshapes the body's entire fat-handling system in a direction that quietly favors plaque. Understanding this is what makes cutting the soda feel less like deprivation and more like switching off a process you would not want running. Number 4. Refined carbohydrates. White bread, white rice, pastries, crackers, and the broad world of products made from refined flour and added sugar. When a grain is refined, the fiber and much of the nutrition are stripped away, leaving starch that breaks down into glucose almost as quickly as sugar itself. The result is much the same as with sugary drinks: rapid blood sugar spikes, demand for heavy insulin release, rising triglycerides, and over years a contribution to the insulin resistance and inflammation that injure the arterial wall. The honest nuance here is important, though. Carbohydrates are not the enemy as a class. Whole, intact carbohydrates wrapped in their fiber, whole grains, beans, vegetables, whole fruit, behave very differently and are part of the healthiest diets on Earth. The problem is specifically the refined, fiber-stripped versions eaten frequently. So this is not about cutting carbohydrates. It is about trading the refined ones for their whole counterparts. We are at the midpoint, so a quick and sincere note. Everything in this video points to real, published nutrition and cardiovascular science, and I would rather you verify it yourself and talk to your own doctor about your own arteries and your own numbers than take my word as the final say. Your situation is specific, and I cannot see it. If you ever want me to walk through the evidence on one of these foods in detail, exactly what the studies found and where they are still debated, that is precisely what this channel is for. Drop a comment with what you would like examined next, because those comments genuinely shape what gets covered here. Number 3, excess sodium. Most sodium in a modern diet does not come from the salt shaker. It comes hidden inside processed and restaurant foods, in bread, in canned soups, in sauces, in cured meats, in snack foods. Sodium's connection to your arteries runs primarily through blood pressure. When you take in more sodium than your body needs, it holds on to more water to keep the balance, which raises the volume of blood and therefore the pressure inside the vessels. That elevated pressure pounds against the endothelial lining day after day, and that mechanical stress is one of the original injuries that begins the whole plaque-forming cascade. High blood pressure is one of the most important and most modifiable risk factors for both heart attack and stroke, and it is especially common and especially consequential after 65. The honest nuance. A small amount of sodium is essential, and some people are more salt-sensitive than others, but the population-wide reality is that most people consume far more than they need, almost all of it from processed sources rather than home cooking, which is exactly why cooking more for yourself is such an effective lever. Number 2. Processed and cured meats. Bacon, ham, hot dogs, sausage, salami, deli cold cuts. This category is genuinely one of the most consistently flagged in the research, and it does its harm through several mechanisms at once, which is why it ranks so high. It is dense in sodium, with the blood pressure consequences just described. It is cured with nitrites, which under certain conditions can form compounds associated with damage to the blood vessel lining and with inflammation. And processed meat consumption has been repeatedly and consistently associated across many large studies in many countries with higher rates of heart disease. The distinction that matters here is between processed meat and plain unprocessed meat. The evidence points much more strongly at the processing, the curing, and the salt and the preservatives than at meat in general. The honest framing remains moderation and frequency. A hot dog at a summer gathering is not the issue. A daily habit of cured meat, several times a week for years, is precisely the pattern the studies were capturing. And number 1, the most worth taking seriously, artificial trans fats. These deserve the top spot because, unlike everything else on this list, they have essentially no redeeming quality, and their harm to the arteries is about as well established as nutritional science gets. Trans fats are created when liquid oils are chemically hardened, historically used in margarines, shortening, fried foods, and many packaged baked goods to extend shelf life. What makes them uniquely damaging is that they hit the cholesterol picture from both directions at once. They raise LDL, the cholesterol that drives plaque, and they lower HDL, the cholesterol that helps protect against it. On top of that, they promote inflammation in the vessel walls. The evidence against them became so strong that many countries, including the United States, have moved to ban or sharply restrict artificial trans fats in the food supply, which is a real public health victory. But they can still appear, often hidden, in some imported, older, or highly processed products, frequently disguised on labels under the phrase partially hydrogenated oil. So the practical lesson is to read labels and avoid anything listing partially hydrogenated oil, because for trans fats specifically, unlike the others, the honest advice really is to get as close to zero as you can. Now, a fair and important clarification, because the list could easily be misread. Notice what is not on it. Dietary cholesterol itself, eggs for instance, is not the villain it was once made out to be. The science there has shifted considerably, and for most people, eggs are fine in normal amounts. Saturated fat is more debated than the old conventional wisdom suggested, with the current understanding being more nuanced than simply branding it poison, though replacing much of it with healthy unsaturated fats remains sound. I mention this because honest health information means updating with the evidence, not clinging to old fears, and because a video that just recites the scary list of the past without acknowledging where the science has moved is not actually serving you. The 5 categories above are the ones the strongest current evidence supports, and that is why they, and not the outdated boogeymen, are the list. It is worth being clear about what this evidence does and does not prove, because that honesty is the entire point of doing this differently. Much of the research on diet and heart disease is observational, tracking large groups over years and finding consistent associations, which is strong and meaningful, but cannot by itself prove that one food causes one outcome in one person. The trans fat evidence is about as close to settled as it gets, supported by clear biological mechanisms, and confirmed strongly enough to drive worldwide bans. The processed meat and sodium evidence is robust and consistent across many studies. The sugary drink and refined carbohydrate evidence is strong and mechanistically sound. But across all of them, the honest theme is the same. These foods influence risk over a lifetime of habit. They are not instant poisons, and cutting back on the frequent and the everyday is what matters, not achieving some impossible purity. That combination, real and consistent evidence held with appropriate humility, is the truthful picture, and it is far more useful than fear. Consider one more realistic example, because it captures both the promise and the honest limits. A 72-year-old retired florist had already had a stent placed in one coronary artery, a clear signal that atherosclerosis was well underway in her body. She was understandably motivated, and she made genuine, sustained dietary changes. She cut sugary drinks entirely, moved away from the processed meats and refined breads that had been daily staples, cooked far more at home to control the salt, and built her meals around vegetables, beans, fish, and olive oil. Working with her cardiologist, and crucially staying on the medications she had been prescribed, she saw her cholesterol and blood pressure improve over the following year. Her doctor was encouraged. But he was also honest with her, and that honesty is the part worth passing on. The diet was not undoing the disease she already had, and it was certainly not a reason to stop her medication. What it was doing was changing the conditions going forward, helping stabilize her situation and lowering the pressure on a system already under strain. She kept both the diet and the medicine, because together they did more than either could alone. That is the realistic picture, neither a miracle nor a futile gesture, but a genuine, worthwhile influence on the road ahead. So here is the practical protocol, the part you can begin acting on at your very next grocery trip, designed to be sustainable rather than overwhelming. Step 1. Start with the single highest value, lowest sacrifice change. Cut the sugary drinks, replacing them with water, sparkling water, or unsweetened tea, because few people truly miss them, and the benefit is real. Step 2. Read labels for the words partially hydrogenated oil and simply do not buy products that contain them, since trans fats are the one category where near zero is the genuine goal. Step 3. Shift processed and cured meats from an everyday habit to an occasional one, and lean on unprocessed proteins, fish, poultry, eggs, beans, the rest of the week. Step 4. Trade refined carbohydrates for their whole grain and whole food counterparts, where you can, whole grain bread for white, intact grains and beans for refined ones, whole fruit for juice, keeping the fiber that slows everything down. Step 5. Reduce sodium mainly by cooking more for yourself and relying less on processed and restaurant food, where most hidden salt lives, and season with herbs, spices, citrus, and vinegar instead. Step 6. Crowd the harmful foods out by adding the protective ones, vegetables, leafy greens, beans, whole grains, fish, nuts, and olive oil, because a plate full of good things naturally leaves less room for the rest. Step 7. Keep taking any prescribed medication, including any cholesterol or blood pressure medication, exactly as directed, and tell your doctor about the changes you are making, because if your numbers improve, your treatment may need adjusting, and that is their call to make with you, never something to change on your own. And throughout, give it honest time, because arteries change slowly, and the benefits of these shifts build over months and years of consistency, not in a single week. And that is the whole of it. Notice, there is nothing here that requires you to live in fear of your own dinner table, and nothing you have to buy. Just a clear-eyed look at the 5 categories of food, the strongest evidence links to artery damage, an honest account of how each one does its harm, and a sustainable way to cut back on the everyday versions while keeping room for the occasional pleasures of a long life. The encouraging truth, the one worth ending on, is that the arteries are responsive tissue, not a fixed verdict, and that the choices you make at 65 and beyond still genuinely matter to them. And it is worth saying plainly that none of this asks for perfection. A single rich meal among many good ones changes nothing about your arteries, just as a single salad among many poor ones would not. It is the direction of the pattern, sustained gently over time, that the arteries actually read. This was never about banning the foods of a lifetime. It was about the quiet, frequent habits that add up, and about nudging those in a better direction in ways you can actually keep. If this was useful, the most helpful thing you can do is leave a comment with the food or the question you would like examined next, because that genuinely steers what gets covered here, and share it with someone over 65 who deserves the honest version rather than the frightening one. And if you want the natural companion to this, the next video looks closely at the foods that actively protect and even help heal the arteries, what the evidence genuinely supports about the heart-healthiest eating patterns, and how to build a full week of meals around them without feeling deprived for a single day. That is the constructive other half of this story, and it is genuinely worth watching next.